Hey, good morning and welcome back to Compound Conversations. I'm Jesse,
And I'm Julie.
and today we're going to talk about knowledge that walks. Um, so, over the last couple of days or sessions, we've been talking about identifying constraints. We've been talking about um, how do you start to segment what things could belong to a human, what thing belongs to an AI agent eventually, and we'll talk more about that later. But one of the most important things for AI agents to be successful is they've got to have access to context.
Mhm.
That's in fact, if there's like one rule that I think you need to be really, really mindful of, or one thing you need to be really thinking about with agents, it is all about context.
Mhm.
Agents without context are going to hallucinate. Agents without context are going to get things, not only get things wrong and be misleading, they actually won't be able to do the thing at all that you want them to do. And at the end of the day, a lot of the infrastructure that we ultimately design around is all about context management. That is it, right?
Mhm.
And so, when I'm thinking about these agents, when we're thinking about agents, it's all about how do we make sure agents have the context they need to be able to be successful. And this context breaks down typically into one of two areas. One, the digital areas that we all use, CRMs, ERPs, databases, etc. But the other is the stuff that lives inside the heads of humans.
Mhm.
And that information is stuff that we don't think about until very often it's too
Right.
late.
Right.
And so today we're going to talk about the information that lives inside of humans, some of the information that lives outside of humans, but how do we really take advantage? How do we recognize the asset that lives inside
Mhm.
the heads of our people? And how do we extract it? That sounds like a very violent verb.
Right.
But how do we extract that information? Julie, have you seen this kind of thing before where people have all this information in their head and there's this oh shit moment when you need to get
Yeah,
rid of
yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, and a lot of times, it's one of those CEOs aha moments, right? Like every single person knows that person. We all know that person. Think about every job that you've had. There's that person who knows everything.
yes.
Right? And the
It's never me, by the way. But
yeah. It's they come to me, they're HR. They're like, "Don't worry, we've got to think about this person," right?
yeah,
But there's every organization has that person,
yeah.
and that person knows everything. And a CEO's typical reaction to that is a lot of times they go to HR and
Why?
they
Why HR? What's
yeah, so they'll be like, "We have a succession planning problem.
okay?
We have a resource problem." We need to think about how do we transition this information. Like they'll make it that far. It'll be something like we need to hire maybe an intern to work alongside this person so somebody captures this knowledge. But we're not thinking about it from a structural standpoint of view. We're thinking about still in the human realm, right? We're thinking about we have this human, so we need to create succession planning.
Is there typically a trigger that makes somebody say, "Hey, we need to go solve this problem"? Because it feels like if you were thinking about it in advance, then you wouldn't actually ever have to go to HR and say, "We have this problem." So I'm almost wondering if
Yeah.
there's kind of like good is good enough until it's not. So what's a typical trigger event for that oh shit moment?
Well, it's usually a lot of times it's like the person getting closer to retirement
Mm,
is one of them. Just kind of that moment where you've got organizational conflict, it's just kind of like there's just like some cultural friction, let's just say. And so at moments like that, when the organization's either growing, transforming, kind of rebuilding, you start thinking about these things. And then all of a sudden everybody has that oh shit moment, right? They're like, oh my gosh, what if Charlie leaves?
yeah.
And then, a lot of times it'll be like, well, HR, what are we going to do? What if Charlie leaves? Right? Like we have to start thinking about the workforce that we build around Charlie so that we don't, when he leaves, we don't lose that information. But we're not thinking about it as, like we said, that asset.
How does Charlie's existence, for lack of a better word, surface up to the leadership team? So if you have a sufficiently large organization, there's probably a lot of Charlies that are living out there in the organization at
Hmm.
different levels, with different levels of experience. I'm thinking back to when I worked in large companies. You would have a department of 40 people inside of an organization of 1,000 people, and
Hmm.
there might be two Charlies with different
Right.
specialties in that one group of 40, and the person that's looking over the entire organization might not know the names of either of those. So how do you surface those people sooner, or how do they get on that radar sooner?
Well, I think that's part of the issue, right? They don't.
Mm.
Right. And so, a lot of times we'll do key talent reviews. So, like, if you're trying to get that a little bit more structured and move it down into the organization, like you'll talk about key talent. So, people will come, all of the managers, directors, whatever, like they'll come to a meeting, then they'll identify that key talent, and then we'll talk about why
Is
that's
that
key
done at a
talent.
departmental level? Is that done at
It
a
just kind of depends on the org and on the org size, but still, it's like, all of a sudden we're like, oh, we need to identify key talent. Succession planning, as much as we talk about it in organizations, the amount of companies that actually have a key talent indicator program or a succession planning program, it's pretty slim. I don't know statistically, I've never looked it up. Maybe I should. But I would say it's in like that 25% ish range. And I think that's being generous, that actually have those processes in place. So to your point, and what we're talking about today is a lot of times it doesn't until they walk out the door.
Mm.
And then it's like, oh boy, how do we do this? I mean, we've all, again, lived in that moment where so-and-so left and somebody comes to you and you're like, go ask this person to go. And they end up going to ask 3 or 4 different people to find out. We still don't know. And then somebody will be like, do you think it's okay if we still text Charlie and ask him this question?
Yeah.
Right? Like, it happens. That is like real work scenarios.
And
That
in real
stuff
life,
happens.
this happened to me when I had one of my key developers I'd had for many years. We worked together. He ultimately was leading the team, and he knew everything about every client, and not just everything about every client, everything about every client's project. And our projects can get pretty complex. And he ended up getting a really good job offer that I couldn't match, and it was a good opportunity for him and for his business, or sorry, and for him and his family. And so I even encouraged him like to go and take
Right.
it, and he was generous. Like he was willing to give me all the time that we needed to do the transition, as well as like access to him via text if we needed anything.
Mm-hmm.
And we definitely took advantage of it.
Right.
But when we started to go through that process of, okay, what lives in this guy's head, and how do we start to systematize it, and we just realized the gap between what
Mm-hmm.
we thought we knew as a company and what actually lived in his head was way larger
Right.
than I thought it was going to be. I mean,
Right.
we would find ourselves spending weeks trying to reconstruct things that he just knew.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it was a really challenging place to be.
Mm-hmm.
In our case, it surfaced because he got this new opportunity, and in this case, we had a really good relationship. So I had ample time and access to kind of patch it over. But I have to imagine in many cases, you might not even have that much time. If someone's given their 2 weeks notice,
Right.
and then they're going to another opportunity. Like I have to imagine that there's a bit of like urgency you have
Right.
to deal with.
Right. Well, and there's some roles where they might give you a 2-week notice, right? But due to the sensitivity of the role, you just can't have them stay for 2 weeks. I mean, there's those type of roles too, where they come in and they're like, yeah, I'll give you notice. And you're like, no, I can't really have that. That's not actually, I can't. I need to, I appreciate the 2 weeks notice, but today is going to be your last day. Sorry about that. And so, that's one of those things where it's really important for organizations to think about, right? Is that you do have that knowledge living in that head. And when we put it into, oh, it's a succession planning problem, or it's a, an HR development path problem, that's kind of the wrong bucket. And so you want to think about how do you get that into more, like we talk about, structural design, right?
Yeah.
Because any AI work that's worth doing needs the information to be able to execute. And again, that's the premise, or not the premise, that's the main theme for today, right?
So it seems like there's two
think about
tracks
that.
here, right? Track number one is structurally, you want to make sure you've got processes for capturing this kind of information. Track number two is, in some cases, when you want to do a particular design for a sprint, that's an opportunity to surface those, because ideally, if we are identifying an area that we want to improve and we've put together our constraint statement,
Mm-hmm.
then the next step is, okay, we've come up with our constraint statement. Next thing is to start thinking about the sources of information
Yes.
that feed that constraint. And those sources break down into the human sources and they break down into the digital sources
Hmm.
that feed that constraint. So both of these tracks, it sounds like, are really important. What are ways you've seen on that first track, the track of create a system that allows this to be reinforced independent of a specific constraint project? I wanted to do a better job at, I'll call it knowledge retention.
Hmm.
Where have you seen that done successfully, or how have you seen that done successfully?
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, I think that's one of those things organizations are challenged with. One of the things I think is really important, and I can't believe as an HR person I'm going to say this, but HR is always like document, 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 right?
Yeah.
And yes, there's capture. We'll talk about that later. Like, there's a difference between document and capture of knowledge, right? But I think one of the important things for people to think about is, how do I do this? And where has it been done well is when companies think about it more like a balance sheet capture
Mm.
as opposed to documentation.
Say more about that.
Well, we're talking about like today, like, the work that walks, right? And the fact that that's an asset.
Yes.
And, we think of humans as human resources, right? But it's really a balance sheet capture, because that information is an asset to the organization. But if you think about it, it doesn't show up anywhere.
That's correct.
So, if we go back to our first session when we talked about how do we get that impact on the P&L, part of as we get to this kind of portion of our process, right? Our framework is to start thinking like, okay, that's a balance sheet. If I was to capture that on the balance sheet, knowing
Yeah.
I don't, but think about it that way. If I was to capture it like a balance sheet, how would I pay attention to that? Right? Things just don't show up on the balance sheet that you pull out of thin air, right? There's documents, there's back work that went into that line item. And I think when we start thinking about that knowledge standpoint of view as like, it's going to show up on the balance sheet, then how do I start tracking and documenting or capturing what that is so that I can really validate it once it shows up on the balance sheet? But,
Yeah.
to the question of who's doing it well and how are we seeing it done well, a lot of companies aren't. And that brings us to why we've got this deploy. Let's deploy AI before we design the organizational structure to be ready for it. And that's that gap, is that kind of that capturing of how we're thinking more in a balance sheet capacity.
I was giving a presentation earlier this week to a peer group, and um, it was all about AI, unsurprisingly. And one of the things that I was sharing with them was that the way after this key employee left, we implemented a discipline of capturing everything through transcripts. Everything
Hmm.
gets recorded. And so they were asking me to show them some demos of some of our agents and how things work. And that's a very tricky thing to do for a variety of reasons. Um, I was showing some aspects of our systems, and I was like, this right here, our transcript library that lives in our systems and is connected to our agents, is probably our most valuable asset,
Yes.
because it's extracted. At this point now, I think we have something like 2,500 transcripts
Mm.
across customer discovery and client discovery, internal meetings, you name it.
Right.
If we've had a conversation about it in the last 2 or 3 years,
Right.
it's documented, it's transcribed, it's categorized, and it is available to our AI brain. And then the point that I was making in that presentation is that every company today, whether you know it or not, whether you believe it or not, every company today is a technology company.
Yes.
And it's because we all use systems, lots of systems, what we would call systems of record and systems of knowledge. We have all of these systems that capture information and capture know-how, but we don't always do a good job, to your point, of either categorizing or being really clear about what we're capturing and why we're capturing
Mhm.
it. And for me, I think all the time that every company is sitting on an oil field
Oh
for their
gosh.
AI,
Mhm.
but none of them, or very few, are tapping in to that,
Yes. Yes.
because information is, like, humans in general, we're not super great at capturing and communicating information. Just look at any CRM, and you
Mhm.
will see lots and lots of gaps where it's like,
Right.
or lots of like, I don't know, I just picked that category because I couldn't think of
Right.
a
Yeah.
better
Yeah.
category,
Yeah.
right?
It's close
Um,
enough.
but that stuff is superfood
Mhm.
for AI agents. But unfortunately, we have a very real challenge of getting it out of the physical head of a person
Hmm.
and into a digital format.
Right. Right. Well, if you think about it, I'll go back to the balance sheet scenario, right? I mean, cash has an opportunity cost,
Yes.
right? Institutional knowledge does not.
Hmm. Say more about that.
So, I mean, we get the cash side of it, right? I
Yep.
mean, again, that's just basic P&L stuff. But that institutional knowledge, again, it's not showing up on the balance sheet. We're not spending time recording it like you're saying. I'd love that oil field analogy because that's exactly what it is. Like if you have all those conversations, you can tap into that and at least get something. Like it's better than, I don't know, can anybody text Charlie? You can at least go into the oil field that you have
Right.
and try to extract something. But that's your institutional knowledge that, again, we're just not, just say treating it. We're not managing it like an asset.
Yeah, I like this idea of the opportunity cost. As I'm listening to you say that, I'm thinking, I think actually there is a significant opportunity cost. It's just that we don't know that there is an opportunity cost. It's like if you didn't know money was valuable, you wouldn't necessarily know that there's an opportunity cost to money. Now that sounds silly on face of it
Right.
because like we all know
Right.
money has some value.
Right.
Um, but if you had, or maybe if you had some precious mineral of some sort that was just sort of sitting in a warehouse somewhere, you've got a bunch of copper or a bunch of I don't know, rare earths, but you didn't know that those things could be used for chips and wires and they were valuable. You wouldn't be like, oh, that's just our stack of rare earths. You'd be
Right.
like, and somebody that walks in that makes chips would be like, I'll take that off your hands for you.
Right.
Right.
Right. Right.
I think this is an interesting analog because I think there is a significant opportunity cost, but I don't think if you don't have the right context, you don't know
Right.
that there's a significant opportunity cost because the opportunity cost of that information is actually the production you aren't getting with
Mm-hmm.
your AI agents.
Right.
It's the production you're not getting with sophisticated workflows and with sophisticated AI agent teams. Um, so I like the idea of thinking about it in terms of an opportunity cost because it allows us to start saying, okay, what aren't you getting
Mm-hmm.
that you could be getting
Yes. Yes.
with this information if you actually thought about that store of data
Right.
as an asset? If every time you looked into your CRM, you saw dollar signs,
Right. Right.
popping up, you'd be like,
Right.
huh, this is worth something.
Something.
It's no longer the X amount of money I'm paying. It's not an expense
Right.
anymore
Mm-hmm.
that I'm paying per month to HubSpot or NetSuite or whatever I'm using.
Right.
There's actually, I'm reinvesting in something. I've got to now treat this a little bit differently.
Yeah. Well, and think about it like I was with a company the other day and I was thinking exactly about this topic. This was earlier this week. So when someone leaves, as organizations, we accept the fact that when they leave, we're going to have to redesign things and relearn things. And we take that as that's normal. That's okay. That's just part of Charlie leaving. We're going to have to redesign. We're going to have to refigure things out. Maybe with Charlie leaving, it's actually an okay thing because it's going to force us to refigure things out and maybe that'll be better. Right?
Yeah.
So that's one. And we just accept that as that's a part of organizational change.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have to.
No, we don't.
Right?
Correct.
The other side of it is we were talking about new hire onboarding. And so, whenever you talk about new hire onboarding, I tend to think about and like to talk about new hire onboarding drag.
What does that mean?
So it's the drag that it takes the organization to bring this person up to speed. Every single person probably listening to this call, they're gonna be like, oh, we have a good onboarding process. Well, most people don't. And quite honestly, most people know they don't, right? We could do better at onboarding, but oh my gosh, we just lost this person. So we've just got to do what we can, right? Every company that I have worked with says they need a better onboarding process, right? And it can always be better, quite honestly. So, but as an organization, we accept organizational drag, onboarding drag as a normal thing. It's a normal cost of doing business that it's going to take 4 months for the new employee to get up to speed once the prior employee leaves. And we accept that. Like there's companies that I've worked with, we've built that in. We know it's going to take 6 months to get the new person up to speed. And so we're going to factor that in. We don't need to factor those things in if we start thinking about, again, the opportunity cost of the institutional knowledge, and we start kind of working with it in a different way. Those things don't have to be accepted drags on an organization, but yet we've all said it's okay. It's
Yeah,
okay.
you're actually making me think. I think I love this point because um, I've got sort of the tale of two employees here.
Mm-hmm.
So we had the one key employee that left, and then we needed to make some changes to this client's project, and it took us weeks to reconstruct and a lot of texts, and we had to go back on a Zoom with this guy and try and figure things out, and it was really, really painful. Then we implemented our knowledge capture systems, our transcripts, our knowledge bases. We got really, really intentional about
Mm-hmm.
knowledge management. So fast forward another year, and we had a woman that had worked on a complex project. We'll call it in January, and then 9 months later, she went on maternity leave,
Yeah.
and something happened with that particular client that we needed to address.
Mm-hmm.
She was on maternity leave. But because we had the discipline at that point of knowledge capture and documentation vis-a-vis transcripts, vis-a-vis our knowledge base, vis-a-vis really disciplined systems around information, what would have been a multi-week, we have to now figure out, we had to, to use your term onboarding, in some level, we had to onboard for every project
Mm.
every time. Because when you've got something that is a really complex project and that person leaves, you might not be onboarding that person into a job per se,
Right.
but to get somebody up to speed
Right.
on a
Right.
complex project would take us weeks.
Right. Right.
Well, this woman goes on maternity leave. We didn't have to call her once. We didn't have to
Mm-hmm.
message her about anything. And it didn't take us weeks to get the thing done. It took us hours
Mm-hmm.
because our systems were so good at knowledge capture. And we, at that time, were starting to introduce our first round of AI agents who were so helpful at
Mm-hmm.
surfacing that information that we could take a developer who had never worked on that project before.
Right.
In fact, hadn't even been at the company that long. And that developer could knock out that work without bothering this other woman on maternity leave, without having to even bother me all that much about
Yeah.
getting up to speed.
Right.
The combination of our disciplined knowledge plus the agent we could layer on top of that knowledge allowed this guy to get the work done in I think it might have took 1 or 2 days.
Mm-hmm.
But that was an improvement from the 3 or 4 weeks
Oh, sure.
because we were really, really intentional
Right.
about the knowledge dimension of our business.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that's where the AI, let's go back to kind of design deploy, right? So a lot of organizations, even when they think about onboarding, they think about knowledge capture as or let me say, the lack of knowledge capture is a continuity risk, right? It's a risk because if we don't have this information, we're not going to be able to have business continuity.
Yeah.
Okay. Like I think most businesses get that part of it, right?
Yes.
But when we move over to the AI side of it, it's not just a nice to have.
Mm-hmm.
To have an effective AI implementation, that you need that information. Like the agent has to have that information in order to have a successful
Yes.
implementation. And so it's not only like the organization needs to understand the importance of that. And again, I think they get the continuity risk side of it. But what the key importance is, now that we're trying to introduce a new player into the workforce, the agent,
Yes.
the lack of this discipline is now just like, and I don't know if we're necessarily naming it. It's the lack of this discipline that is causing the challenge for every AI implementation, because we just bring it in,
Yes.
we throw it on top, and we say, well, wait a minute, how come this isn't working?
Yes.
And it's because of that. It's the knowledge isn't just a continuity risk measure. It's the cake. It's the cake to the icing that's going to make any AI implementation actually work and produce the outcomes that you want to have happen out of that
If I were to
technology.
think about a human analog, it would be like hiring a human and bringing them in, but they don't have a desk and they don't have a computer. Maybe,
Right.
maybe you give them an iPad
Right.
and they're like,
Right.
well, yeah, I need you to build complex spreadsheets, but here's your iPad,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
Like it would be very, very difficult for that person to do a good job,
Very, yeah. They
right?
need the tools.
They need the tools to do it.
Right.
And
Right.
in the world of an AI agent, those tools are databases. Those tools are um, CRMs, they are ERPs. They are the digital infrastructure that currently we have humans managing.
Right.
What agents don't have. So if you were to bring a new hire in, let's say, as an example, to replace Charlie, right? Because Charlie exists in the world and in space with agency. Charlie can go up to Julie and say, Julie, I need help understanding A, B, C, and D. Before Charlie leaves, this new person can go and ask Charlie all these questions. It can be proactive
Right.
in a way that agents can't be. They don't
Right.
exist in time and in space. They can't self instantiate
Right.
yet,
Right.
right? And so, in order for an agent to be able to work, it almost needs to have the directive, it does need to have the directive thrust upon it in advance. But if it doesn't have that desk, it doesn't have that computer, it's only got an iPad,
Right.
it's not going to be very effective.
Right.
The thing is, like, this stuff isn't sexy. Like, everybody wants to figure out, how do I build agents? How do I get agents? How do I get
Right.
agents?
Right.
I have this question. I have this conversation probably every day at
Oh
this
gosh,
point.
I'm sure.
And
Yeah.
the answer is almost, you're not
Ready.
ready for
Yeah.
it,
Yeah.
right? Because the best you can currently do at the moment is learn how to use Claude AI really, really well, or Chat GPT really, really well, because you haven't created the environment
Right.
for an agent to thrive.
Right.
You haven't created those preconditions. You haven't yet recognized information has an opportunity cost
Mm-hmm.
and that it is an asset. But as soon as you make that shift,
Yes.
then you can start preparing
Mm-hmm.
to create that basis that allows you to do successful implementation.
Right. Right. Well,
So
you
what,
cannot automate what's in a person's head. I mean, that's kind of the headline, right?
yes,
We cannot automate or we cannot build an agent based upon something that is completely undefined
correct.
and that is in somebody's head. And that's why that knowledge transfer, right? As organizations, we just do it right now, human to human. And we get 25-30% of that actually knowledge transferred. But that's why we're having such a challenge with AI implementation. I mean, you see this and I see it all the time. You say to people, are you using AI? And they go, oh yeah, I have a chat GBT. And you're like, that's not what we're talking about here,
No.
right? There's chat GBT, there's Claude. Yes, there's systems out there. But when you talk to most people right now and you ask them about AI, they say, yes, I use Claude, or yes, I use ChatGPT, or I have a ChatGPT.
Yeah.
And his name is, whatever, right? That's not what we're talking about. When we're talking about structural workflow improvement, which is, again, comes back to the compound framework.
Yep.
The framework is how to have that become part of your infrastructure, if you want to say, on how you do work. Not, I have an agent.
Right.
Everybody can have an agent. You can go into your computer right now and download whatever you want and not have an agent. Everybody has access to AI.
Yes.
But that's the interesting part, I think, of where we're at right now is everybody says, oh yeah, I'm using AI. I asked it a question the other day. That's not what we're talking about.
Correct.
That's not how you get it to the P&L.
That's correct.
That's not what we're going to find, that we're going to drive the headcount paradox, where we're going to grow revenue, but yet we're going to be able to grow our people in a much different way. That's when we get to this point where we're talking about, how do we know what's in a person's head so that we can create those workflows that actually decrease the drag. And once we decrease that drag, again, you're going to see you have more resources to put towards other things that's going to drive revenue.
Yes.
I mean, that's the premise around Compound, is that we need that full framework. And it's not just, I have a Chat GBT, or yes, I have Claude. That's not enough.
No. And I think if you want to start moving in this discipline, and again, we talk about these two tracks. There's the discipline of doing this as part of just your organizational, recognizing we've got to do this going forward. Here's how you implement it. And then there is the other track of actually doing this as part of a sprint. one of the things I will tell people all the time when they want to know how to get started, my answer is almost always transcripts.
Mhm.
You've got to start recording things in, and there's this idea, well, no one ever reads a transcript. And that's true because
That's not why you're doing it,
the
though.
transcript
That's the
isn't
part
for
we're
you or
missing.
me,
Right,
right? The
right,
transcript is superfood for AI.
right,
It's tedious
right.
for us, but
Yes,
we don't have to
yes.
read it.
Right,
We
right.
just need to make it available. And what's so great about transcripts is because the way AI works, AI can pick up nuances and patterns and subtext in transcripts that it can't get from other what I would call lossy forms of information,
Mhm.
where you've decided to write the summary,
Right,
you've decided to make the notes. You're inherently filtering
right,
as you do that,
right.
and that's going to steer AI in a direction that might not be long term net helpful,
Mhm.
right?
Right.
So from a structural standpoint, I think if you do nothing else, you've got to start recording your conversations, your work, especially when you're making a decision. Um,
Mhm.
Now, how you manage all that with governance and access and taxonomies, that's a topic for a different day.
Right,
But just starting by transcribing things
right,
is already a good start.
right. It's
You
knowledge and it's part of the asset base.
Yes, 100%.
Mhm.
So now within the context of a particular sprint. So one of the things we talked about is, okay, I want to implement AI in this particular way or to solve this particular problem. We've identified a constraint. And so let's just imagine we've got a constraint statement.
Mhm.
So the next thing is, okay, I've got a constraint. I know I want to solve with AI. The second step is to say, what sources of information feed this constraint? Those sources are going to be either human
Mhm.
or digital.
Right,
Okay.
right.
We can get to digital in a minute. So let's talk about human. So now I need to figure out how to capture information from a human. I've got my constraint statement. Next question is, whose judgment does this constraint depend on? So if you're thinking about a particular piece of work, in my example, for instance, um, this project, we had that one developer who had a name, and that developer, his judgment is what fed that particular constraint.
Mhm.
How do you surface in an organization who the relevant stakeholders are so that you can make sure you're capturing the right people contributing to a constraint? Is it always the process owner? Is it other people? Like, how do you figure that out?
Yeah, that's a challenge because it's usually not always the same person. It's not easy to find the person. Um, I sometimes talk about load-bearing roles,
Mm,
right? So there's roles in the organization that are load-bearing, and everybody's like, "Well, what does that mean?" Right? If you think about a load-bearing role, it's a signature, not a title.
what does
And
that mean?
so think about it in terms of process, right? Where's the point that, everything gets signed off by Heather. Everything goes, through this. That's kind of like the inherent structural process that's developed because we know this person has knowledge and we trust them. So they're the signature.
Okay.
It's not necessarily the title. So it's not a title thing that we can say, oh, that person is always the CFO or,
So this
oh,
might be
that
a
person.
subject matter expert.
Right. Well, there's a couple. It could be a subject matter expert. A lot of times I'll see it as the person who's the translator, right? That person who's the connector in the organization, who just knows where everything's buried, right? That's kind of like your translator connector person. And sometimes that's a very load bearing. If you think about an executive assistant to a administrative assistant to a CEO, very load bearing role,
Hmm.
right? Knows a lot on organizations and how it's kind of like operating. But then sometimes it is a knowledge bearing role. But if you just kind of think about in your organization, um, like kind of think about where's everything getting signed? Where's the signature space happening? That's probably a load bearing spot because again, if that person's not there, there's a reason why that person has been selected to be the signature on so many different things. And signature, I mean, it could be an electronic stamp, whatever, but it's like the approver, right? So those are a couple of buckets. It's like that signature space, that translator space, your knowledge base. Those are all going to be kind of like your load bearing roles. that you're going to think about, okay, there's a reason why. You might not know where to start, but you can go, there's a reason why that person is doing X, Y, Z, A, B, C. Does that make sense?
It does.
Yeah.
So you identify who these people are and the extent to which the constraint depends upon them. I think the next thing is not everybody's equally load bearing, to use your word, right? There are
Mm-hmm.
risks of some more risk with some people than with other people. So let's say you've identified a particular person. I think a good next question is like, how many people would be affected if this person
That's a great one.
wasn't here,
Yes. Yeah.
right?
Yeah. That is
So
another
if
one
we
of
were to
these.
just
Yeah.
pop that person out,
Right.
who can now not do their job, or
Right.
where would that job start to get real hard, real
Yes.
hairy?
Yes. Yeah. 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 That's usually that signature person, right?
Yes.
It's that there's that person that again just kind of has this pulse of controls, not control, but controls around the organization. And sometimes they have knowledge, sometimes it's, like again, a process thing. But if you extract that person, and again, we all know that person. I mean, I can go through every single job I've ever had, and I can name my first job ever in a bank. It was Betty. I can tell you, Betty was the person, right? And, so like we can all name those people. We just haven't necessarily kind of taken that next step, right? To identify what do we do? What do we do with that information?
So identify the person. We identify how many people would be impacted if this person wasn't there. And the next question is around exposure. Like, should we anticipate any kind of planned exit, retirement? What's the probability that that person is going to get poached?
Right,
Who's creeping on their profile on LinkedIn,
right,
right?
right.
And then documenting what's the cost of that
Yes.
person
Yeah.
were to leave. And I think if you sort of take those couple of factors, the person, how many people would be affected, so the concentration, the exposure, the probability that they're going to leave or could get poached, and then that cost
Mm-hmm.
helps you come up with a risk flag. Might be low, might be medium, might be high. But in my estimation, as it relates to a constraint, might seem obvious, but the people that are the most at risk
Mm-hmm.
are the ones you probably want to start with when it comes to knowledge capture. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And if you put it in corporate terms, think about, we all have a CRM. We know where that data lives, right? We all have like an SAP or some type of a financial program, operational. We know that program. We know where the data lives. We probably know, for the most part, how the data gets in and how the data gets out.
Yes.
But then we have this person who's got this risk flag, and we should know just as much about that role.
Yes.
And if we take the time to know that, oh, I don't have the time to do that. Well, you know what? You don't have the time not to, because you're going to get all of those operational, organizational drags when that person leaves. So, and you're going to miss something.
Yes.
So if you take the time before you're at that risk factor with that person who's got flagged, it's valuable time.
So now once we've identified that person, the next thing we want to do is sort what they know. And you and I talk about the TML framework all the time,
Mm-hmm.
and sorting what they know into these buckets: tasks, things that need to get managed, decision rights and rules, and then ultimately leadership, things that require judgments, relationships, whatever. Because that ends up being the basis when we get to the design phase,
Mm-hmm.
the basis upon which we start to figure out how to design the work. Can you just talk a little bit about the TML framework and what that is again?
Yeah. So TML, I mean, it's pretty simple in like its construct, but yet sit there and try to do it for yourself on your role. It's not as easy as it sounds, but TML is task manager leader. So it's which roles are task oriented, which roles are management based, and then which responsibilities, and which responsibilities are leadership responsibilities.
Yeah.
And, what you'll find is that some responsibilities actually are going to be both, right? So then you have to break that down one step further, right? Okay, so if feels like more of a management responsibility, is there any task piece in here that I can carve out? Because a lot of times when I work with organizations, they'll go through right away and it's like TM, TM, TML, TML, and they just assign. But then the hard work is, it's like, okay, now go back. The T's we can put over here. but now let's deconstruct. We talk about work deconstruction all the time. Let's take another shot at those M's and the L's and see if there's any flavor at all of a T in any of those M's or L's. And there usually is.
I'm sure.
And so, but first it's just thinking about your role and what those things are. Because the task side, if we go back to the agentic ability, right? If we can identify those tasks, we can effectively implement
Yes.
an agent and build it around that.
Those tasks can be easily delegated in many cases to an agent. The things that live in that middle column, the managed column, are things where you generally are probably going to want to have a human in the loop.
Right. We need judgment. We need judgment.
Exactly.
Right.
And then on the leadership column are things that you want to then keep exclusively human in most cases, right? But getting that information out is challenging. And so one of the things we then suggest people do is interview these stakeholders. You know, I've made a big to-do about transcripts. And I think this is where you can start to extract the information that lives inside of that person's head so that you can then start to segment this TML in a particularly nuanced way. And by the way, my experience has been that asking people to do their own TML exercise off their head tends to be less robust than having a really good transcript and then asking AI to extract it from the transcript. Right. Because the AI will generally extract from the transcript nuance that the human is thinking and saying out loud, but is filtering when we are documenting on our own.
Right.
Because when we document on our own, we have the a priori assumption that the world model that I bring, the assumptions that I bring when they get put into paper in a sentence, that you've got that same understanding. So when you see, the 8-step process for reconciling a quote against a rate card written down, because, I wrote it down, like my thinking is, oh, Julie knows exactly what that means.
Right.
Like, what the hell's a rate card? I have no idea what that even means.
Right.
And, but we don't think that with that level of specificity. But if you're having a conversation and like we are today, and, I mentioned, oh, yeah, one of the things I do is I do the 8-step process for reconciling quotes against rate cards.
Right.
And you're like, what's a rate card?
Right.
Then I'm like, oh
gosh.
a rate card is yada, yada, yada. Like, okay, so what is that 8-step process?
Right.
Oh, that's easy. Step 1 is da, 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 da. Step 2 is da, 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 da. Right. So we've just extracted all of that information in a much more nuanced way so that when we feed that transcript over to the agent, that agent will be able to then, and again, when I say agent, I'm being a little loose. You can do this with a regular Chat GPT or Claude. You upload that transcript and then say, hey, let's run TML on this transcript. That model will be a lot better at making those distinctions than if I asked you, Julie, to fill this out for yourself.
Yes. Yeah. I completely agree. And if you go back to like last week when we talked about the whys, like a lot of times it's really interesting when you get into like your example, do the rate card. If you take that and then break it down and you kind of, well, why do you do that? Well, why do you do that? Why do you do that? And you apply that 5 why theory to those statements that you've developed that, again, you assume everybody knows. It really kind of gets interesting too, because there's the what and the why.
Yes.
And sometimes both of those lenses on trying to identify that work could become really important. And you might even come down to the why of, we don't even need to do this.
That's happened to me way more often than you realize.
Right. Yeah.
When we start building our agent teams, there are a lot of times when we will go through this kind of an exercise and say, well, we don't need to do that.
Right.
I gave an example in one of our previous conversations about developers doing documentation inside of our ERP.
Right.
And as we dug into it, realized we don't need developers to do that work because we can have a system do that for us automatically. But on that list, like we had a big old T, which was update this documentation. And by the way, next to that big old T was a lot of chili peppers for how hard this thing was because it was such a pain in the neck and was causing so many pains. A lot of little crying face emojis from Marina's perspective, right? And then we realized, well, we don't need to do that in the first place, to your point. And all of a sudden that just goes away. And now the smiley face emojis show up and the work goes away, which means the $ emojis also now show up.
Exactly.
So capturing this information via an interview is super, super important. In general, there are lots and lots of different tools people can use to do interviews. You could use something like Otter AI. You could use others. I'm old school. I would just pull up voice memos. Voice
Mhm.
memos now will do the transcript for you automatically.
Right.
Um, so this doesn't even need to be that difficult. What I think is more important is that you have some structure to it.
Yeah.
And so that you ask good questions like, what decisions do you make that nobody else makes?
Mhm.
If you've done the exercise at the beginning and you figured out who else is involved in the constraint, so tell me about how you interact with Julie. When do you get Julie involved? Why do you get Julie involved?
Right.
Right. So trying to understand the decision framework that somebody brings is a really good set of
Mhm.
questions.
Mhm.
The second is the exception framework.
Mhm.
Oh, you said you do this like this all the time,
Except
except over
when.
here.
Right.
So tell me about that exception.
Right.
Why does that happen that way?
Mhm.
Right. And again, the goal of this is just to uncover what's in that other person's head. I think the third good thing to ask in these interviews are rules of thumb.
Mhm.
You know, so maybe most people probably aren't going to tell you their 8-step process because many people haven't documented their 8 steps.
Right. Right.
Right. So I might say, okay, so you manage quoting via these rate cards. How do you decide, whether you should quote A or B? And that person might say, well, I've got a, do you have any rules of thumb? And that
Right.
person might say, yeah, actually,
Right.
when I do this, I think about it this way. When I do that, I think about it that way. Another good question is, walk me through the last difficult implementation or the last time you struggled to make a decision, or
Mhm.
walk me through the hardest example or the biggest lesson learned, trying to uncover a historical narrative
Right.
in order to understand what they weighed and why they weighed it against your real work.
Mhm.
And then finally, if I needed you to train somebody on this, what do you think they would get wrong and why?
Mhm. Mhm.
And I think if you've got these good questions, what decisions do you make? What exceptions have you handled? What rules of thumb do you use? Walk me through examples.
Mhm.
And what would a new hire get wrong? I think what you'll find is you'll have extracted a lot of really, really valuable information from that
Mhm.
person, and you'll have provided adequate context for any large language model to
Right.
help you start doing the TML work on their role in a really,
Mhm.
really easy way.
Mhm. Well, and I think the importance of that process that you talked about, and we've put together a worksheet that we'll be sharing with those questions on it, because those questions asked in that way are such a different pattern from how we've always thought about jobs, right?
Mm,
So anybody who's ever written a job description,
yes.
right? Have you ever asked those questions in a job description prep session? My guess is no.
Right.
And so think about, if you start thinking about work with the ability to do that deconstruction so that we can design before we deploy, so that we can get to our constraint statement and understand our sources coming in. And that's as far as we've made it in the process, right? Framework. But if we can do those things, we're thinking about work in such a different way, and we're getting different outputs from the conversations. And those questions that we have on the worksheet are vital. They're
Yes.
so important, and they're so different
Yes.
from the way we're talking about work today. They're really critical, and that's why that critical nature, in order to design before deploy and have successful P&L generating deployments, that's the whole key right there.
Well, then I think, okay, once you've done that, you then want to make sure that you've done a pretty good job capturing it by
Mhm.
checking that translation layer. You mentioned the translation role.
Mhm.
So once you've extracted this information and it's documented, then could you give the artifact that you put together, the SOP or whatever the input to that statement is, to someone else? And could they work from it? Could they
Mhm.
understand it?
Mhm.
Um, could that information that you've now extracted as tasks, are they well sorted in your TML framework? Is the judgment, so you mentioned how a lot of times people will label things M and L, then you have to go back through it. Are your M and L categories, when the AI segmented them, are the M and L categories specifically reserved to judgment,
Mhm.
or do we need to ask it to do another pass the way you might a human?
Right.
Right. Then can a person actually access that information in its rawest form if they need to either to make edits or to be able to work with that information at its core, right? It's very easy to say, oh, well, I did the interview, I've got
Right.
it captured, it's done. But as you get ready to move from source to design and then design to develop, right? It might sound like I'm being real nitpicky about
Mhm.
being precise, but the reality is you do have to
Right.
be
Right. Right.
precise, particularly when you go through automation, right?
Mhm.
You've got to be really clear. Okay. If I can't give this to a person
Mhm.
and that person can't figure out what to do, there's a good chance the agent won't be able to figure out what to do.
Exactly.
If that
Exactly.
knowledge, if the knowledge isn't well separated into TML, you're gonna have a real hard time putting the SOP together and training a person to now who's not already not used to M
Mhm.
as their
Right.
primary job,
Right.
how to do M because they're, the T's aren't as clear as they should be. So I think to your point, having a systematic and structured way to solve this is it might seem tedious,
Mhm.
but we cannot underscore how important it is
Mhm.
to get your knowledge right if you want a successful AI implementation, because context is everything. And the primary driver of context is knowledge. And by far, the hardest piece of knowledge to get is the knowledge that lives in the heads of your best people.
Or the knowledge that walks.
No, that Julie,
Yes.
always a pleasure.
Oh my gosh. Another,
This time,
another, it
I
just
look at the
flies
clock
by.
sometimes. I'm like, the time just flies
I
by.
do too. I just hit the button like a few minutes ago, and I'm like, wait a minute, we've got more to say on this. So it always flies by.
It
But
always
thank
flies
you,
by.
everybody, for joining us. As we always like to say before we close out, let's stop transforming and let's start compounding. See you next time.